Let's talk about power. Power and truth. Power and truth and life. You know, what's the goal of life? Well, I don't know. You don't know. Maybe you do. But whatever the goal of life is, the goal of life, let's just call it life. Whatever it is, maybe you think the goal of life is discovering yourself, loving people, loving God. You could say there's a lot of different goals to life. Getting married, having kids, reproducing, that's the goal of life. Replicating. So there could be a lot of different goals of life out there. But let's just call the goal of life for now. It's an acronym. What does it mean? I don't know. But we're just going to assume maybe the goal of life is to pursue truth. Maybe the goal of life is to escape samsara and obtain enlightenment. Maybe the goal of life is to make as much money as possible and to YOLO. You only live once, so collect as much wealth as possible, collect as much power as possible. Whatever you think the goal of life is, that goal can be broken down, or at least there is, at this moment, unless you live a perfect life, and if you do, congratulations. But if you don't, then what you're admitting is that there's a space between the life that you now live and the life that you should be living. That there is a space between the perfect life, the goal of life, and where you are right now. And so you're at point A, and the goal of life is at point Z, and you need to get there. And so you have to go through B and C and D and so on and so forth to get there. And maybe the goal of life is ultimately radically simple. But despite that fact, there are some certain complexities and falsehoods that you need to work through. Or maybe it's not falsehoods, maybe, I like to use the term lies, maybe you've picked that up now. I like to boldly say that if something is not accurate, it's a lie. Doesn't matter whether the person is mendacious or malicious. All that matters is it's a falsehood, and therefore it's a lie. It's inaccurate. But let's say you have perfect, true knowledge of what's going on. You know exactly what's happening. You say to yourself, I need to make more money. I know how to make more money. I just need to put in the time, put in the energy, put in the effort. That's great. But whatever is the goal of life, there is a certain degree of power that's needed to overcome those obstacles. If the goal of your life is to destroy your attachment to all material possessions, there's a certain amount of power that you need to overcome the attachments that you have through time, energy, and effort. And there's a certain direction from learned masters that you would follow their path, you would follow their instruction. There's a certain truth for every outcome that you can conceive of that you would call the goal of life. The goal of life is, however you want to define it, that's an outcome. And to obtain that outcome, what you need is, you need power. You need power first and foremost over yourself. Because at the end of the day, that's the only power that you have. If you do not have power over yourself, you are a tool of either your genetics or your environment. And some people believe in that sort of determinism, that you are simply a product of your genetics and your environment, and you're simply living out a predetermined course. Even if that were so, there's still a process of rationalization that you're going to engage with, where you're going to say, hey, this is the purpose of life, this is the goal of life, and in order to get that outcome, that I'm predetermined to get in this Calvinist sense. In order to get there, I need to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z because it's my fate. You know, I'm fated to do it, if that's the case. So, whatever your goal is, wherever you're headed, there is some path that you have to follow. And some paths are true and some paths are false, in the sense that if you want to make money, there are true methods to make money and there are false methods to make money. And so if you want the power to make money, you have to follow the truth that leads you to that power. Truth is information. It's a particular kind of information. It's not just random information. It's not false information. Truth is information that encodes a method or a process or a perspective, a way of seeing the world that's going to allow you to obtain power. And that power is going to allow you to obtain your goals. See, if you have a lot of power, if you have a lot of money, but you don't have any goals with that money, life is quite arbitrary and meaningless, because, you know, how are you going to spend that money? You don't know if you don't have a goal. But if you don't have the power, if you don't have the money, it doesn't matter what your goal is, you won't accomplish it. And if you don't have the truth, then you won't have the right goals and you won't have access to power. So these three things, I guess, you know, I'm taking the word life and I'm taking the word goal and I'm using them interchangeably. But these three things are sort of interdependent. And we should think about information and communication in this way. We shouldn't think about truth in the absolute, you know, well, it's true that, etc., 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 and people try to make arguments. And what happens, in my opinion, is that arguments are emotionally motivated and people want to say things like, I have an ugly truth. I have an ugly truth. You might not want to hear my truth, but it's an ugly truth and somebody needs to say it. Implicitly, that person's concept of the truth is that the truth is independent from power. That even if the truth were a weakness, that you should embrace the truth. And I think this is fundamentally a misconception of the truth. And I'll give an example. In the Bible it says, love your enemies. And a lot of people take this to mean, well, Nietzsche, for example, takes this to say, this is slave morality. This is a person who has been cucked, right? This is a person who, you know, would evolve into the my wife's boyfriend meme, right? This is the conclusion of that sort of thinking. But what I think love your enemies really means, what it's pointing to, is the idea that you should not hate your enemies to the extent that you sacrifice your own power. And I'll give you a very real example of this. People hear love your enemies and they hear, oh, that's ridiculous. That must be some kind of ploy or plot or trick to enslave me. But let's view the opposite. What if you hate your enemies? What if you really hate your enemies? If you hate your enemies more than you love yourself, then you will do things to hurt your enemies that also hurt yourself. You'll be a kamikaze. And I see this in people's relationship with authority with power between children and parents. I see children looking at their parents and saying, my parents have done me wrong, they've hurt me, they are my enemy, and so to hurt my parents, I will do poorly. I will do poorly in my life, in my school, in my job, in my relationships, in my attitude. I will be a dysfunctional adult. I'm going to act like a child. I'm going to have a prolonged adolescence. I'm going to do all of this to become a burden to my parents, to cause stress for my parents. I will become a drug addict. I will become lazy. I will not accomplish anything. I will do this in spite of my parents, because to succeed would make my parents happy and proud, and they would win, right? And so someone said to me recently, I said, you know, you're having these issues with authority. What would happen if you just pretended to be happy, pretended to be normal? Just fake it till you make it, get over the hump, do what you need to do, and come out the other end. Could you do that? And they said, no, because if I do that, then they win. If I show them that, you know, their method is okay, that, you know, they were right after all, if I admit defeat, then I lose and they win. But essentially that person has set up a scenario where I lose and they win means I have to stay unhappy, I have to stay a loser, I have to stay unsuccessful in order to, you know, cut off my nose to spite my face. And so I think this is the meaning of love your enemies. It's not, you know, if someone hits you, you should, you know, give them a hug. That's not the meaning of love your enemies. The meaning of love your enemies is give them what they're due and release them from your wrath and release them from your judgment. It's not your responsibility to punish evil. It's not your responsibility to punish evil. If someone has done you wrong, and a lot of people will probably do you wrong, if someone mistreats you, if you give something to someone and they do not return the favor, if you promote somebody and they betray you, they abandon you, they castigate you, they turn around, they're a Judas, right? Judas is the enemy of Christ. But Christ says, love Judas. Now, there's a difference between love and infatuation and admiration and respect and fear. But all of these things get confused together. But love really just means give people what's right and give people what's fair, ultimately. And do not become attached to them in a selfish way. To love another human being means to do what is in your power to help them. And to not become absorbed in them as an object of worship from this perspective of angelics or demonology, to not make a god out of that person. Maybe I'm just making all of this up, but that's how I take it in the best way. Love your enemy, right? And so I think it's things like that where people hear love your enemy and they say, well, that makes no sense. But I guess that's what the Bible says. You know, the Bible says love your enemies, so I guess I have to, you know, when someone slaps me across the face, I should give him the shirt off my back, and et cetera, et cetera. And like, there's a sense in which that is true. There's a sense in which you have to conceive of a very powerful forgiveness in order to free yourself from being absorbed with trying to hurt other people over trying to help yourself. I mean, you could spend your whole life resenting dead people. Let's say someone does you wrong and then they die. You could spend your whole life resenting that person, wasting time, energy, and effort focusing on a dead person. Or you could release them and forgive them. It doesn't mean that you forgive and release the bad things that they did and say, oh, those things were okay. It means that you say, that person no longer occupies my mind. There's a kind of forgetfulness in forgiveness. There's a renewal in forgiveness. There is a release of tension, of the self-imprisonment of the person who says, you know, I'm absorbed in the negative worship of a person. So, but when we misunderstand that, when we misunderstand something like love your enemies, and there's two ways we can go about it. We can either say, you know, that's a trick, that's a lie, that's demoralization, or we can say instead, well, I guess that means I have to be powerless. I guess that means weakness is strength and failure is success, and it becomes Orwellian, right? It becomes Orwellian. But that, I think, is where this conception of the divide between truth and power comes from, that there are some who are truthful and weak, and there are some who are powerful and false and deceptive and lying. I think there's a deeper truth here, which is we have to view like different levels of truth, right? So, you know, is it true that if I treat people in a certain way, they will treat me a certain way? Yes. And there's a certain level on which we're not nearly, like the statements that we say are not simply descriptive, right? The statements that we say also carry emotional, tribal, identity. They carry heart, they carry soul, they carry weight. You know, what we say, if someone says, I'm a libertarian, are they merely saying, I like low taxes? Or are they also saying, I am part of a tribe, I'm part of a group, I have a certain psychological profile? So when we say things, we're signaling a sort of affiliation. We're signaling our goals, we're signaling our values. When we say I'm a libertarian, it's more than just saying I like low taxes. There's this whole bundle of stuff that says this is what I'm focusing on to the exclusion of other things. That's something that we don't often think about in our statements of truth and our statements of politics. Is when you say one thing, you're necessarily ignoring and putting aside all the other things that you could possibly say in that moment. There is an opportunity cost to every truth statement. And so if I say, you know, the sky is blue and the grass is green, is that true? Yes. But if I if I read you the phone book, is the phone book true? Technically, yes, the phone book is true. What if I read you an offensive phone book? What if I go to a funeral and I start reading out cards against humanity? Is that true? I'm just reading the card. Look, I'm just reading the card, you know. Sorry if that offends you, liberal. I'm just reading the card. I'm just reading cards against humanity at this funeral. My question to people is, what are you doing? What are you trying to do? I think that most people have a very self-defeating attitude. I think most people don't have real goals in their life. I think most people feel hopeless. I think most people feel powerless. And what that translates into is they feel there's a disconnect between truth and power. They feel that there are those who are powerful, and those people lie, and they're evil and mendacious. And then there are those who are weak and persecuted, the martyrs, the victims, and those people speak the truth. And there is, we can't ignore the Christian dimension of this. Whether you think this is a correct or false interpretation, this is coming clearly out of Christianity. And for me, the truth is more important than the label. And so there are people out there who will say, well, this is clearly Christian, and therefore we should reject Christianity. And there are those who would say, well, that's not real Christianity. That's fake Christianity. And real Christianity has nothing to do with that. And therefore, you know, we don't have to worry about that. And we're going to spend time defending real Christianity and depicting it in contradistinction to fake Christianity and arguing and so on and so forth. And my point is, like, the branding has become so muddled that I'd rather not debate the branding. I'd rather debate the truth. And when we think about politics, most people view politics as an opportunity to play a victimization game, to say that you've harmed me, you're part of a group that's harming me, I hate you, I'm going to project evil into, I'm going to look at you with the evil eye, and I'm going to attack you psychically, spiritually. And if I hate my enemies enough, then they lose. But what I'm saying is that you got to love your enemies. You've got to love your enemies enough to let them go. When the hatred of your enemies is not serving you, let it go. There are a lot of people in your life who are going to attack you. They're going to attack you on baseless charges from a number of angles. No matter who you are, no matter how you identify or don't identify, people are going to attack you on the basis of your race and your gender and things that you can't change and things that you didn't choose. And what you can say is, I hate my enemies and I hate them so much that I'm willing to build my entire identity and my entire worldview around spiting these people. You know, they said that it's bad to be white, and so I'm going to be super white. And they said it's bad to be a man, so I'm going to be super sexist, and so on and so forth. And I understand why people do it. It's a reaction, and it's somewhat, it's part of a deep part of ourselves, a fight or flight, that if somebody attacks you, you have to defend yourself. You have to fight back. You can't just let them win. You can't let them do that to you, because what would that make you? That would make you weak, defenseless, a slave, passive, etc. And so on some level, the vital instinct is there of the reactionary, the vital instinct to live, to survive, to defend oneself. It's there. But the question is it truthful? Is it truthful? And to ask if it's truthful, to me, before we understand truth, or at the same time, like these are almost simultaneous things, we cannot have truth. There is no such thing as truth independent of a seal, of a goal, of a raison d'être. There is no truth independent of life. This is what I'm trying to say to you. There is no abstract truth independent of existence and of reality. Reality is a determinant qualifier upon truth. Things which are not true don't exist. Things which are true do exist. And by the same token, with respect to human beings, those things which bring us closer to life are true, and those things which bring us further away are false. And we have to determine that, or we at least have to think about that. Anytime we claim something is true or false, and we argue about it with others, and we create tribal distinctions, and we say, you're part of my tribe, and you're not part of my tribe, we have to stop and we have to ask ourselves, is this bringing me closer to power? Is this bringing me closer to my goal? What am I trying to accomplish here? Because we can read Cards Against Humanity, and we can read the phone book, and we can point out things in the world that are uncomfortable. And we can play the troll, we can play the jester, and we can say the emperor has no clothes. But where is that getting us? Is that fueled purely by resentment of power, purely by resentment of authority? You know, you've probably had authorities in your life that have treated you unfairly, and perhaps your parents did abuse you, or perhaps you feel that the elites have abused you, and you're like a child of Bill Gates, and you're striking out against him, and all of these people. And I understand that, right? There's something ancient about that, the patricidal spirit, to fight one's parents, that we see with Zeus, that we see with Zoroaster, that we see with Jupiter, and with Odin, and even with Christ to an extent. But we have to ask at some point, are we going to dwell in that? Are we going to focus on that? We can, and people do for their entire lives, focus on being simply contrarian for the sake of contrarian. I mean, I wish I could memorize, I wish I had a Homeric memory where I could just memorize YouTube comments, because someone commented something that was essentially, you're not controversial, okay? You don't offend the left, you don't offend the right, you don't offend anyone, and so therefore nothing you can say is true. Now that actually in itself contains a little bit of truth, we have to admit, right? We have to admit that that itself is to an extent true, and the reason why is because if your goal is political OnlyFans, and your goal is to create outrage and to capitalize on people's outrage and get Patreon donors and such, then yes, you want to offend the left, you want to offend the right, you want to create controversy, you want to create that drama. I understand that as well as anybody, and I engage in it as much as anybody else, but we have to, well, maybe we disagree. Maybe we'd say, some people would say I engage more or less. But nonetheless, we all engage with it to some extent or another. And we just have to recognize the truth for which it is pushing. The truth, the power that it is giving us, the power of the edgy, the power of the troll, the power of political polarization and tribalism. What is the power there? The power is the power to create these little micro religions, these little cults, and to say, follow me, I'm your leader, I speak the truth to power, I say the things you're afraid to say, and you should follow me and give me money and whatnot. But as much as that is just a dominant reality of our times, of our economy, our economy is, our political economy, as it's presented to us, is about making us hate people, making us hate Democrats, making us hate Republicans, and that's profitable, or to make us hate the far right or the far left. I mean, I've received hate, right? I've received hate from people who don't know me, they don't know my positions, they don't know who I am, but they see me as yet another target to express resentment that brings them closer. I mean, there's a schadenfreude that they get. They want to hurt their enemies, and they view me as a little voodoo doll. I'm representative of the globalists who are destroying their lives. And so they attack me, and they get some kind of satisfaction, otherwise they wouldn't do it. You know, I do think there's a point to the libertarian concept of praxeology. The people do what they want to do. The question is what they want to do ultimately the best thing for them? Often not. But people do what they want to do. People do what they do because being angry makes them happy. People watch horror movies because feeling scared makes them happy, right? That happiness, we could call it a perverse happiness, a false happiness, not a true happiness, but nonetheless, there is some kind of dopamine cycle going on here. People cut themselves, people self-harm because it makes them happy in a perverted sense. So we just have to be honest about that. And so the way that people conceive of politics through the lens of resentment, through the lens of hate of the other, hate of the immigrant, hate of the Jew, hate of the globalist, hate of the capitalist, hate of the billionaire, whatnot, I can understand the psychological process that brings people to that point. And I don't blame the person necessarily. I think there are, low quality people out there, and there are people who you could teach them the right way to live and the right way to think, and they wouldn't get very far. And other people get trapped, I think, in very sick ways of thinking, but that's not their destiny. That's not who they were meant to be. That's not their fate to be an automaton of hate, that they could go beyond that. And I just don't know what's out there. For me, it's an adventure. For me, it is a mystery that, when I see people, I am a judgmental person, and I do judge people on the basis of their intelligence, their emotional intelligence, their sociability, their charisma. I judge people on all those things. But on the internet, talking to an anonymous audience, I never know who's watching. That's the wonderful thing that Twitter has taught me, and Telegram and these things, meeting people, going out, driving across the country and finding beautiful vistas. What I've learned is that you never know who's watching, you never know who's lurking. Someone could be lurking who is a CEO, someone could be lurking who is quite young and impressionable. Someone could be lurking who's quite old and already has grandchildren. Someone could be lurking. You don't know who's lurking. You don't know what kind of message is going to hit them. You don't know what kind of message is going to strike them and allow them to see the error of their ways, allow them to see that they have lost sight of their goals, the goal of life. They've lost sight of power, and they've engaged with this question of truth on a basis of resentment. If we're not constantly keeping the purpose of life, which could be called morality by some, Nietzsche had his own conception of morality called master morality. However you want to phrase it. But if your conception of truth isn't fundamentally concerned with power and morality, then I think it's empty. I think it's pedantic. And I think ultimately, if we're not aware of these somewhat Freudian instincts that we have, resentments, ancient feelings that our ancestors felt, nothing has changed about human psychology in 10,000 years. It's all the same. And so all the same ancient wisdom still applies. So if we are trapped in negative thoughts, in things that are not serving us, they're not helping the people that we love. We say we want to save this, we want to save that. It's like, well, who's going to save you? If you were in trouble, if you were sick, who would save you? Who would save you? Are we organizing around principles?
Nice. Subscribe. Very good.
Nice. Beautiful,
Very good.
Beautiful. You're going to love it. If you love autism, you're going to love my channel. Okay, great.
All right.